What's going on, guys? With Sucrose once again being a rate-up character on the most recent banner for Albedo, I thought now would be a great time to make a guide on how to play Sucrose. Sucrose is one of the strongest support characters in the game and is easily obtainable by free-to-play players because of her 4-star status. There are several components to Sucrose's kit that make her an extremely powerful support, including crowd control, the ability to proc Swirl with all 3 of her talents, and boosting the elemental mastery of your entire team. In addition to this, the Viridescent Venerer artifact set, her best in slot support set, provides Sucrose with the ability to do more damage herself, as well as enable the rest of your team to do more damage. With the way that Swirl reactions work in this game, she can easily dish out damage numbers around 10k with a single elemental skill. In this video, I will not be providing an entire build guide, as she is honestly pretty straightforward to build and there are several other good guides out there. However, I will explain the equipment I use and why. But in this video, I want to focus on exactly how to play Sucrose to enable your entire team to maximize their damage. Her kit has a lot going on, especially with the Viridescent Venerer set included, so I'm going to show gameplay footage and explain exactly how her talents can boost your overall DPS. First, let's talk about the Swirl reaction and exactly how it works, as I think it is one of the more confusing reactions in the game. A Swirl reaction picks up a single element only and applies it to all enemies in the area of effect. This can cause a new elemental debuff on an enemy or an elemental reaction if a different element is present on a nearby enemy. When Sucrose creates a Swirl reaction, she will do a Nemo damage and additional Swirl damage if an element is present. Now let's get into Sucrose's talents. Her first talent, Wind Spirit Creation, deals a Nemo damage with her normal attack and AoE a Nemo damage with her charge attack. This talent actually has the ability to swirl. Therefore, damage from this attack scales both off of Sucrose's attack as well as her elemental mastery. In the first clip, we use Klee to debuff with fire and then swirl. You can see Sucrose does both Anemo damage and swirl damage dealt as Pyro. In the second clip, the enemy is holding a torch and already affected by Pyro. Again, Swirl does both Anemo and Pyro swirl damage. In the third clip, we have a Cryo Slime which always has the Cryo status. Our swirl damage is dealt as cryo, so her attack does swirl, but the enemy is immune to cryo damage and only takes Anemo damage. The fact that she can swirl with a normal attack is beneficial for both her first passive talent and primarily for the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set bonus, which we will get into shortly. Swirling an element will unlock the potential of your main carry or other supports to do additional damage, so being able to trigger this with no energy cost can come in very handy. This attack by itself is extremely powerful with a character like Fischl, who can continuously apply elemental status to enemies. Because although Sucrose's normal attack may only be hitting for hundreds of damage, the additional swirl with each normal attack may hit for 1,000 plus, allowing Sucrose's normal attack to deal significant AoE damage. Her second talent, Astable Anemo Hypostasis Creation 6308, deals AoE Anemo damage. Damage is relatively high at 243% with just talent level 3, and this talent also has the ability to swirl. Anemo damage scales off of Sucrose's attack, while any resulting swirl damage scales off of Sucrose's elemental mastery as well as her level. Because of the large area of effect and the amount of enemies the swirl damage can hit, this is one of the reasons why building elemental mastery for Sucrose can be very beneficial. This is because when Sucrose uses her skill or burst, there can be more swirl reactions that occur than Anemo damage alone, and swirl reaction damage scales with her elemental mastery. Let's look at a few examples of how this ability exactly works. In the first clip, we have one enemy with an electro debuff and the other with no debuff. Both enemies take Anemo damage as well as swirl damage in the form of electro. In the second and third clips, we see 3 enemies each holding a pyro torch. An electro debuff is applied to one enemy. Pyro swirls when Sucrose uses her E ability, and Pyro and Anemo damage is applied to all enemies. An overload reaction is triggered on the enemy with the electro debuff, which causes overload AoE damage to be applied to all enemies because of how overload works. In the fourth clip, we trigger Hydro debuff on a Hilichurl near Pyro Slime. Pyro is swirled when Sucrose uses her E, and the Pyro Slime doesn't take Pyro damage, but the Hilichurl takes Vaporize damage. These clips should help you to understand how both Swirl and Sucrose's elemental skill work. This ability can be best used in a couple of ways. Because this ability will knock enemies up and pull them in, it is great for crowd control. It can be used to cause reactions between enemies nearby with different elemental debuffs, and it can apply a debuff to all enemies in an area, which can then be exploited by your main DPS or other support. For example, if a cryo debuff is spread to multiple enemies, you could then use a pyro character to proc melt and do double damage. Sucrose's third talent, Forbidden Creation Isomer 75 Type 2, is similar to her elemental skill in that it performs AoE and Nemo damage and sucks enemies in. In addition, her burst procs a total of 3 times over 6 seconds, or 4 times if you have Constellation 2 Sucrose. With each tick of her burst, she will deal Nemo damage that scales with Sucrose's attack, additional elemental damage based on the first element that her burst comes into contact with, which also scales with her attack, and Swirl damage which scales with Elemental Mastery. Let's look at some clips to also understand how this works. In the first clip, her burst doesn't come into contact with an element, it just swirls water and does a Nemo damage. In the second clip, the burst comes into contact with water and also swirls water. The water slime is immune to water and only takes a Nemo damage. The cryo slime takes a Nemo damage, swirl water damage, and water damage from her burst. In the third clip, the burst comes into contact with fire and also swirls fire. In the fourth clip, the burst comes into contact with electro and also swirls electro. This causes massive overload AoE damage, and only the pyro slime takes electro damage. Overload does not occur a second time because the pyro slime is debuffed with electro. In the last clip, we drop her burst and it doesn't immediately pick up an element even though we applied cryo. Her burst can be a little tricky to control and understand. However, we do see that if it does not pick up an element on the first tick, it can still pick up one after. This attack stacks a ton of damage as well as allows for multiple debuffs and elemental reactions to occur during its duration, and is extremely useful for mob clear and domains in Abyss, much like Venti's Q ability. Now let's look at Sucrose's passives, because this is where it arguably gets more interesting. For this test, we remove the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set. Her first passive talent is Catalyst Conversion, and it states that when Sucrose triggers a Swirl reaction, all characters in the party with the matching element have their Elemental Mastery increased by 50 for 8 seconds. We're going to see exactly how this works. Before Sucrose swirls, we see that Fischl has an Elemental Mastery of 86. After Sucrose swirls the Electro debuff applied by Fischl, Fischl's Elemental Mastery increases to 136. Now with their second passive, Malus Favonius, when Sucrose uses her E or Q, all party members get an increase in Elemental Mastery by 20% of Sucrose's Elemental Mastery for 8 seconds. After we use Sucrose's E with Fischl's Electro debuff, Fischl has an Elemental Mastery of 229. Now let's look at how this affects an overload reaction procced by Fischl. Looking only at the numbers in red, the base damage Fischl does for performing overload is 1,979. With passive 1, overload does 2,062 damage. With passive 2, overload does 2,508 damage. So she is doing over 25% more damage just by Sucrose performing Swirl. When Sucrose has her ult up and continuously applies a debuff to an entire crowd, you can easily take down a mob of enemies in the 6 seconds that her ult is up. It is important to note that this buff only applies to reactions and not to pure elemental damage. Therefore, in general, these passives become useful when several of your party members can apply their bursts at the same time, or you can spam elemental combos to create reactions. Now let's talk about my build and how I build Sucrose to increase the damage of my team even more. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, the Viridescent Venerer Artifact 4-piece set is best in slot for running Sucrose as a support. The 2-piece set increases Nemo damage by 15%, while the 4-piece set increases Swirl damage by 60% and decreases enemies' resistance to the element infused in the Swirl by 40% for 10 seconds. Looking only at the numbers in purple, without this set, Fischl's Electro damage on the Ruin Guard was 1,301 after Swirl. With this set, Fischl's Electro damage on the Ruin Guard was 1,663. The piece that I had to swap out has about 60 less Elemental Mastery, so keep that in mind, but this change has little effect on our overall damage output from reactions. Overload damage is essentially the same for Sucrose while running the 4-piece set, but we see Fischl's Electro damage get greatly enhanced due to the 40% reduction in enemy defense against Electro. As for artifact main stats, I recommend Elemental Mastery on the Sands or Circlet, Anemo damage on the Goblet, and either Energy Recharge, Elemental Mastery, or Attack in the third slot depending on what you're lacking. My main stats are currently HP, Attack, Elemental Mastery, Anemo damage, and Attack percent. I'd like to replace my crown with an Elemental Mastery crown once RNG blesses me, but for now I'm happy with her damage output. We can see the real benefits of Sucrose's passives and the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece set bonus with the Klee Melt combo. Without any buffs, non-crit melt damage from Klee is 7,382. With Sucrose's passives but without the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set, melt damage is 11,066. With Sucrose's passives and with the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set, melt damage is 14,922. With a critical hit, this is easily 30k damage with mediocre artifacts that aren't fully maxed on Klee or Sucrose. For a weapon, I'm running Sacrificial Fragments. This is probably your best in slot support weapon for two reasons. First is the Elemental Mastery secondary stat. We saw how important Elemental Mastery is to Sucrose, not only for bigger Swirl damage, but also for passing 20% on to her team members. Even as important as the secondary stat is the weapon's passive, which provides a 40% chance of ending the elemental skill cooldown. This can occur once every 30 seconds. Sucrose's elemental skill only has a single charge until she is Constellation 1. It is highly recommended to obtain a C1 Sucrose for her to become much more viable. I recently got Constellation 1 and decided to invest more in her build. With 2 charges on her skill, there's about an 80% chance that she can end the cooldown and utilize a total of 3 charges. This allows her to deal more damage but also generate more energy for increased uptime on her burst. If you do not have this weapon, another option is the craftable Mapamare from the Blacksmith, which also has an Elemental Mastery secondary stat, and a passive elemental damage bonus. If she is playing support, you should really aim for Elemental Mastery or Energy Recharge secondary stats on her weapon. Because Sucrose's main strengths are grouping crowds and boosting your team's elemental mastery, she fits best into teams which can deal a lot of elemental damage and combos. Assuming your team synergizes well together, she should fit into nearly any team. Pairing Sucrose with others that can leave elements on the field after switching, such as Diona with her elemental burst, or Fischl with Oz, lets you do large amounts of damage to mobs clustered in a small area while gaining increased reaction damage. Sucrose also pairs extremely well with the main DPS that can reliably apply elemental damage, such as Klee, as she will easily boost their elemental damage by 50% or more with her buffs. She also pairs great with another Anemo user, such as the Traveler or Jean, because the elemental resonance decreases stamina consumption, increases movement speed, and decreases elemental skill cooldown. That is all I have for you guys today. I've been struggling a bit with understanding everything that happens when Sucrose performs a Swirl reaction and thought this guide could be helpful to others as well. If you guys found this video helpful and informative, consider subscribing for more content. I put out a Genshin Impact video just like this one every week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.